bell has struck 2 p.m. So let's get going. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch to those of you who are with us this morning, and welcome in to our new audience members. We are glad to have you at the Beyond Binary Conference, Gender in the Past, Present, and Future. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our Interdisciplinary Research Exchange. Dr. Natalie Bennett is the director of the Women's Leadership and Resource Center at UIC. Dr. Bennett is a scholar activist whose research, teaching, and activism centers the lives of Black women and girls. Her interests are transnational in scope, located at the intersection of Black feminisms, gender, class, sexuality, and social policy in Jamaica, and migrations in the African diaspora. Her publications focus on transnational migration in Caribbean with immigrant women's labor, racial and sexual identities among African American lesbians, and the politics of same sexualities in Jamaica. We are grateful to have Dr. Bennett moderating this interdisciplinary research conversation. Thank you for being here, Dr. Bennett, and please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Nick. So, welcome back to the afternoon session. We're going to kind of roll in the order of the program just to make things a little easier. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I hope it will certainly build on the really rich and generative discussions that we've had so far. So first up is Robin Dembroff of Yale University. Robin is an assistant professor in the philosophy department, and their primary areas of research are feminist and LGBTQ philosophy, which they approach using metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language. Their research emphasizes relationships between dynamic social processes and social classifications. They're currently working on a book on patriarchy, yay, and have published in both academic and popular venues, including Scientific American, Time, and Boston Review, another yay. They received their PhD in philosophy from Princeton University in 2017 and their MA from the University of Notre Dame in 2014. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for agreeing to moderate. It's exciting to be on this panel with so many people whose work I deeply admire and respect. So I'm going to try to, I have 15 minutes, so I will try to make sure I stay in the timeline, which philosophers are historically not the best at, or among many other things, but also that. Let me see if I can get this going. All right, do you see my slides and not the presenter view? Yeah, great. Okay, cool. So first, I just want to thank Mark and Linda for all of their work together. It's been really amazing to listen to everything that's happened so far, and I truly never cease to be amazed by the amount of wisdom that there is in our community, and I appreciate you all sharing that with us. So my name is Robin. I call myself trans, queer, non-binary, but don't be surprised if you hear me call myself a gay, a lesbian, a twink, a butch, a transsexual, a homosexual, many other things. Gender is super contextual, and I don't think I have some sort of essence that lies underneath all of that code switching. And so I'm coming to this discussion from the analytic philosophy, which I just want to acknowledge that the tools of analytic philosophy tend towards general and abstract conceptual frameworks. And so because of that abstraction that's, I think, required in order to do theory abstracts away from the particularities of gendered experience. So my hope is that I can do that abstraction without idealizing, that is, without distorting or falsifying that experience. But for any ways that I fail to do so in what follows, I apologize in advance. All right, so my goal, kind of following up on what Lucy was saying, is to sort of intervene in what I think are some sort of conceptual assumptions that have led to unnecessary conflict and unnecessary talking past in discussions about what gender is. So, I mean, in philosophy and outside of philosophy, we're interested in this question of what is gender. I think, of course, there's many different ways of answering this question because the word gender is used in many different ways in different contexts. But one motivation, and a motivation that I think frames the scope of what we're interested in when we ask this question, is a motivation to try to explain systemic gender injustice. That is, to pick out the thing in the world that explains what makes a certain pattern of unjust distribution of privilege and disadvantage count as gender injustice specifically. And so there's been an interest in saying what gender is relative to that question. But I want to draw out two kind of assumptions that people often make in asking this question. So the first is a kind of reduction of the question to taxonomy. So the question is posed, what is gender? And people immediately translate this question into the question of what are, fill in the categories in an operative taxonomy here, like what are men and women, right? And it's a really common assumption that in the framework of a society that assumes a kind of binary taxonomy, immediately reduces the question of what is gender to the question, what are men and women? And in addition to that substantive assumption, there's often another substantive assumption that appears. And mainly here, I want to note, I'm mostly criticizing philosophers here, as well as the way it goes in the public discourse. I'm not trying to pin these kinds of assumptions on people operating outside of philosophy and the humanities. So then there's a kind of individualism that's often assumed as well, which is the idea that these gender categories that are in that taxonomy should be defined by the individual features of their members. And we see this again in both philosophical literature and in popular dialogue about gender, where people argue about what makes someone a man or what makes someone a woman as a proxy for the question of what gender is. But I want to just note here that this is not an obvious assumption to make. So suppose we were to try to understand a category like Christian or like Los Angeles Dodgers fan. It would be weird to think that those categories could be reduced to the features that make someone a Christian or the features that make someone a Dodgers fan, right? Is an important assumption that's being made that the category, we're trying to understand what a category is in the world, we can reduce it to what makes a given thing a member of that category. And in the case of gender categories specifically, this assumption of individualism has translated down into various essentialisms, whether it's biological essentialism, certain kinds of social essentialism, as well as, and increasingly, I think, especially as people appeal to scientists to make sense of trans identity, we're seeing a kind of psychological essentialism as well. And so putting both reduction and individualism together gives us a picture on which the question of what is gender is reduced so much that there's this common idea that gender is being a man or a woman, and being a man or a woman is fill in your favorite essentialism here. So I think there are many paths to note from the beginning. I think there are many paths to undermining both this reduction and the individualism, many of which come from historical looks at gender and gender dynamics, others of which come from the recent intersectionality literature. But given the topic of this conference, I want to focus on how non-binary specifically can be used as a sort of wedge to undermine both individualism and reductionism about the question, what is gender? And in addition to that, points us to a different kind of answer to the question of what is gender, which looks to gender as a process that undermines all those various taxonomies and their differences across time. And I mean, I'm not going to go too much into this, but it kind of, in the introductions mentioned that I'm writing a book about patriarchy. I'm trying to kind of bring back this notion of patriarchy as a helpful theoretical tool for thinking about that underlying process that remains, that persists even through taxonomic change. Okay. And I guess I'll say one other thing about this, which is I think that this question of how to make sense of the fact that gender is both culturally specific and it varies hugely across context and time, while also somehow maintaining gender as some kind of unifying basis for political solidarity across contexts, is basically kind of the stalemate in a way that feminist and like a lot of feminist theory has been at for the last few decades, where you get both an understanding and an acknowledgement that gender is co-constitutive with race and with class and with disability and so on, but also trying to make sense of how it can be both co-constitutive and not the same thing, and therefore something that can be looked at cross-historically or cross-contextually in a different way than you would look at race cross-contextually or cross-historically or class and so on. So, of course, I'm not going to try to answer that here. I'm just trying to say that non-binary will help point us in a particular direction for thinking about that question, much less answering it. Okay, so to start off, what do I mean by taking non-binary seriously? I mean, basically, something very simple, which is to acknowledge that within certain contexts, non-binary functions as an alternative to being a man or being a woman. And here I'm focused on non-binary in more of the contemporary sense and not in the historical sense that Leah talked about earlier, where it was much more tied to a sort of intersexuality or a specific way of the body being, as opposed to in our more contemporary context where you don't need to have a specific androgyny in order to have access to this category. Okay, so if we take non-binary seriously in this sense and say, okay, yes, there are contexts, and increasingly so, there are contexts where non-binary is recognized as an alternative to being a man or a woman, as man-woman operates in that particular context. So I think the reason why non-binary undermines an individualistic approach to this category is because there aren't shared features among members of the category. Now, I think everyone in this room probably agrees that this is true of men and women as well, right? We have the failed feminist search for a unifying universal feature of women. But I think that there's a lot of cultural energy that goes into the appearance of homogeneity among men and women. And so it can be harder for people to see that an individualistic approach to these categories is going to fail, even though I do think it will fail. But it's easier to see in the case of non-binary, because when you look at the number of people who identify as non-binary, you see that they're heterogeneous across what their bodies are like, what their social positions are like, and also in terms of their identity, not in the sense of what they call themselves, even if they use the same term, but the sort of psychological states and preferences and desires that underlie the use of that term, right? The use of calling oneself non-binary. And so if you adopt individualism in the way that people have tried to adopt about men and women to understand non-binary, you end up with a kind of anti-realism about non-binary. It looks like there's no such thing that there is to be non-binary. It's at best maybe a sort of linguistic construction, a word that all sorts of people apply to themselves, but one that doesn't really have any content beyond just the term and maybe a few connotations of the term. But I think that taking non-binary seriously, again, requires seeing it as a substantive social reality, that there are contexts in which being non-binary operates as a social category in much the same way that men and women do. And we can't make sense of that if we try to reduce non-binary to a mere linguistic construction. In previous work, I've suggested that non-binary, again, in the contemporary context, can be helpfully understood by thinking of it as a category of people who collectively do something, who collectively resist the process of being defined and regulated in accordance with an ideology that says men and women is an exhaustive, discrete, and exclusive binary. And so if we understand it in that sense, against focusing on the collective, the basic idea is that we understand non-binary as fundamentally a social and political category, one that you can only understand fully if you understand how the collection of people within it relate to the reproduction of a given social hierarchy and social categories in their social context. And so in this way, kind of going back to some of the discussions that happened earlier today, I would challenge any kind of dichotomy between identity and political formation. I don't think it's a choice between the two, at least when it comes to non-binary. Here is that non-binary is, yes, it's an identity in one sense. It's a way that individuals understand themselves, but in another sense, it's a social category that arises from that collective identity, that in turn gives legibility and intelligibility back to those identities when they are articulated in the social world. So it's something that is essentially collective. It can't be understood as an individual identity. It's more greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. Okay. And I think one thing that this helps us with, if we go back to men and women, right, we've had this failed project of saying, what is the universal feature of men and women, and looking for something that's a universal feature, and that's been a failed project. But I think we can take this lesson from non-binary back to those categories. And again, I'm not going to try to say exactly what it would look like, but rather than arguing about the individual features of these categories, I think that we can learn something from some of the feminists of the past who have instead tried to understand it as a class, as a collection of people who are collectively situated by a certain process of definition and regulation. And again, that's for doing a particular project, which is understanding a certain kind of systemic injustice. So you have to be doing that project in order for this kind of methodology to be the best one for your purposes. Okay, so another thing I think, in addition to the undermining of individualism, is that non-binary also helps us undermine a reduction of the question of gender to the question of gender taxonomy. So when we take non-binary seriously in our context, right, we see that there are communities that even in recent history have changed their taxonomies, not only in the sense of what categories are available in those taxonomies, but also in terms of how individuals become organized within them. So in communities where non-binary is an available category, that's of course an opt-in category where anyone can opt into it, it thereby makes the categories men and women opt out. They're no longer required categories. By non-binary being an alternative that's opt-in, the binary becomes opt-out. And that's a very fundamental change to the way that gender taxonomies operate in these communities. And given that kind of shift, that leaves us with a question, if we assume any kind of reductionism, of how to respond. So if you hold on to reductionism and you think gender just is gender taxonomy, you either have to deny that this change exists, which conflicts with empirical data, or you have to think that gender ceases to exist as soon as the taxonomies change. But that doesn't seem like a very good way of going. That's going to come with huge explanatory costs for trying to track gender across time. And so if we give up on reductionism, it returns us to the question of what gender is prior to particular cultural taxonomies of gender that are applied in a given context. And this is where I think non-binary can helpfully point us to gender as a particular process rather than a particular set of categories or taxonomy of categories. And this helps us, I think, answer this problem of persistence that has, I think, plagued feminist theory for the last few decades, which is to say, if gender persists through the different gender taxonomies, if gender is something that can be a site of solidarity across time and across cultures, then what is it? How do you make it something that persists, but nevertheless can manifest in such a variety of ways? And I think that non-binary points us toward the beginning of a kind of anti-essentialist answer. If gender isn't some sort of essence that therefore allows it to track it over time, people have assumed gender was an essence because if something has an essence, it makes it very easy to track it across possible worlds, across time, across cultures, and so on. But if we think of gender instead, kind of go back to this idea of historical, genealogical, process-based understanding, and understand gender as a process of definition and regulation, where that regulation and definition happens according to a historically rooted, and I think particularly rooted in an unjust sexual division of reproductive labor, but nevertheless developing ideology across time that can provide us with a through line, a sort of continuity despite massive variation. Okay, I'm done. Sorry, I went a little bit over.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. Thank you. You actually, like, this conversation, I hope, is also transdisciplinary. And so I kind of start to hear echoes of the historical kind of approaches in your work as well. All right. Up next is Jules Gill Peterson. Jules is a research associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. Is Jules here?
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Hi, there you are. Okay. Jules is a research associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, published by Minnesota Press in 2018, and winner of a Lambda Literary Award. Yay! She's also general co-editor of TSQ. That's the Transgender Studies Quarterly. You're up, Jules.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I just want to echo the thanks to Mark and Linda and to everyone who's taking time to join us today. And it's particularly nice to share space on this panel with each of you. So lovely to see you all in this remote intimacy. So my paper is called Transsexual Theory Talks Non-Binary. I don't have any slides, so I will attempt to be exciting enough on my own. Okay. When my book, Histories of the Transgender Child, was undergoing peer review, a sneaking suspicion formed in my mind that one of my reviewers might have been a queer theorist. Now, I don't know who either of those reviewers were, so if that person is listening today, come for me in the Q&A if I say anything inaccurate. But the perception on my part formed when, at the end of an incredibly useful and generous reader's report that really helped the manuscript transmute from a collection of researched ideas into an actual book, a question was posed about my treatment of trans kids in the past, as, well, boys and girls. That is to say, the words that they used to describe themselves. Wasn't I reinforcing the gender binary by calling them trans boys and girls? This was the overall sentiment as I divined it. And as the reviewer put it, though I'm admittedly paraphrasing from memory, doesn't the history of trans kids lead to questioning or overturning the gender binary? To which I could only reply then and today, no. That's with 3 question marks, as a millennial would write it in a text. The presumption smacked of queer theory to me because as the story has gone now for nearly 3 decades, trans studies and queer studies don't get along, apparently. Queer theory has long read and treated transness as a cutesy theoretical container for the abstract trouble of gender it loves to imagine out there somewhere, meanwhile steamrolling over trans people's lives in the process and often textually punishing them for failing to subvert norms or deconstruct the binary. The exemplary case for a long time has been Judith Butler's theoretical victim blaming of Venus Extravaganza for her own murder, memorialized in the documentary Paris is Burning, a death in which Extravaganza, according to Butler's reading, perversely got what she always wanted, to, quote, be treated by the symbolic precisely the ways in which women of color are treated, end quote. Because Venus dared to dream of being real instead of a queer gender rebel, quote, her death thus testifies to a tragic misreading of the social map of power, end quote, in Butler's words. Words that, since they were printed in Bodies That Matter in the 1990s, have generated trans critique significant enough to form a bedrock of the academic field, from Vivian Namaste to Jay Prosser, to more recent critiques of both queer studies and trans studies. Critiques now turned more on their lack of differentiation, as in Andrea Long Chu and Emmett Harson Drager's, in my opinion, criminally misread dialogue in TSQ after trans studies. Indeed, there's been something like a little transsexual turn in trans studies over the past few years, though I'd hazard to say, like many academic trends, it's really sort of a lagging indicator in a larger English-speaking, American, college-educated transsexual turn in self-identification and cultural politics. In the academic form, in any case, it has to do with questioning the post-transsexual foundations of the field, where that term refers back to Sandy Stone's 19th essay, The Empire Strikes Back, which is taking aim at Janice Raymond's transphobic magnum opus, The Transsexual Empire. Chu and Harson Drager mine Stone's post-structuralist intervention, which is incitement to transsexuals to refuse the demand to pass, and instead to attempt to transition, quote, as a genre, a set of embodied texts whose potential for productive disruption of structured sexualities and spectra of desire have yet to be explored. That's Stone. Harson Drager points out simply that this move installs the non-transsexual as the ideal object for trans studies. Chu adds that in its very Donna Haraway idiom, Stone's post-transsexual, quote, is not just an attempt to disavow transsexuality, it's also an attempt, like Cyborg before it, to be post-woman. To which I might add a provisional gloss. Much of the work of the word transgender, and now often trans, as well as non-binary, is in the outcome anti-woman, anti-trans woman to be precise. I don't really find roll call especially meaningful in diagnosing something that I actually consider to be incredibly ubiquitous, but it's not hard to do either. The presumption that trans women are retrograde for wanting to be real, wanting to be women, is a tendency that I think has, however unintentionally, been massively aggravated by the popular uptake of non-binary discourses of gender. The very production of the illogical category of binary trans woman could be one, piece of evidence, which as a historian, I'll say as an aside, makes precisely zero conceptual sense to me. Or to put it otherwise, is a willful declaration of impossibility, insofar as no one can be an imaginary ideal like a binary. And the only condition of being a gendered subject in the world is to be one in a system that thrives on the paradox of the binary being generated out of an essential non-binary incoherence, or what I have termed in my book, the plasticity of gender. Yet that phrase, binary trans woman, has nonetheless become yet another cultural whipping girl, to borrow Julia Serrano's phrase. We could think of, for example, though I'm sorry to make you think of it, that egregious open letter, a phrase I put in scare quotes because it was in fact signed by a hilariously tiny handful of people, one of whom was notorious misogynist grifter Buck Angel. This letter from earlier this summer, in which a few white trans masks disavowed trans womanhood as unsightly and pathological perversion to which they had no allegiance as upstanding gentlemen. But there are far less ridiculous examples that abound. Non-binary influencers Jacob Tabaya and Alok Menon were both criticized in 2017 for an interview in which they explained the intense pain they have both experienced in being rejected by men as a silver lining non-binary virtue. Unlike those other girls who they joke about removing body hair and taking hormones, they did not succumb to the false consciousness of transitioning just to please men, or so the line of thinking quite seriously implies. Softer still was one of the Twitter wars du jour this week, or du semaine, when an interview with Scottish writer Finn McKay received a great deal of backlash from trans Twitter, both for offering a compromise position to a poison pill question from a transphobic Guardian reporter, that perhaps it would be reasonable to just not let trans women into domestic violence shelters because some cis women are scared of them, before McKay went on to narrate the apparent virtue of their decision not to medically transition or even ask people not to misgender them, as somehow making them the true feminist. Quote, "If someone's being introduced on the radio and the word she is used, then people are thinking, oh, a she can get a doctorate or go on the radio, and that's political to me." Okay, each of these examples is interesting to me, not because I have real beef with any of these people, except for Buck Angel, who took a disturbingly declared pleasure in attacking me online and refusing all the while to acknowledge either that I was a trans woman of color or that I had a PhD. But in any case, my point is that I see the so-called non-binary, binary as symptomatic of a mutation in the constitutive trans misogyny that in an earlier moment animated the queer theory that disapproved so of transsexuals, always seemingly women of color, and then the trans studies that has apparently rolled over and said, sure, why not, in agreeing that the only goal of thinking about gender, let alone having one, is bringing about the end of the binary. I actually find the proposal to move beyond the binary to be a red herring in several ways that I think are really interesting, but let me offer three. One, the proposal grossly overestimates the scope and repressive hegemony of something called the gender binary, which, as I hope my book has shown, but others certainly have too, doesn't really work that way at all. In other words, to my mind, sex and gender work effectively, and perhaps most effectively, by presupposing and actively incorporating the conceptually non-binary into themselves. And if sex and gender are, as I've argued, biopolitical arrangements, they really eclipse the desire to separate the individual from society. On the contrary, sex and gender are the transactional point between the individual and the population. Point two, I think the idea of going beyond the binary consigns to queer and trans people above all a moral and political imperative to be radical by one singular definition of radicalism, with no right to their own desires, languages, cultures, and modes of being that exceed this wildly ethnocentric description of resistance, which often takes the form, not coincidentally, of a flexible neoliberal Western subject. And third, it suggests that gender abolition or deconstruction or subversion is a consensus point of view, as opposed to a specific contextual, political, and intellectual proposal originated once again in the West, predominantly in the English language and through white theory and white thinkers of the social and political. So with these caveats, then, I want to ask some questions of the category non-binary, which is to say, offer some prompts towards non-binary methods and ideas for queer and trans studies, because it strikes me still as rather odd that there are very few non-binary texts, certainly theoretical texts, relative to the predominance of non-binary as a taken for granted identity category available to the field's practitioners. So these are questions to which I don't necessarily have answers or even think that I'm the most qualified to give the answer, but I wanted to offer them both to our panel and to the conference. So there are 5 of them. 1, how can you dissent from a system of gender while still maintaining its central presumption, which is that gender is a profoundly important constituent of the self? 2, if every identity is valid so long as it is articulated and thus can be respected, how does one give an account of the self that is not finally relativistic to all others? 3, if gender is an internal sense of self that can take any form and thus defy any social norm, how does non-binary gender work relationally or phenomenologically? 4, how does non-binary femininity differentiate itself from previous categories that were explicit intermediaries between man and women, including, for example, some of the ones that I'm studying: fairy, street queen, hormone queen, faggot, and invert? And 5, how does non-binary reckon with its ethnocentrism? That is, if it is indeed a supplement or reparative to a fundamentally Western bourgeois gender binary that only exists as the outcome of 5 centuries of violent colonial expropriation, anti-Black political economy, and the racialization of sexual difference, how does the category bear that inheritance? And how could it ever possibly achieve any accountability or escape velocity in its contemporary usage from those historical processes? These are, I hope, interesting questions for trans studies and queer studies to do more than reiterate a queer theoretical claim to undoing, deconstructing, subverting, overcoming, or just troubling gender for another 30 years. I would be delighted to see what non-binary methodology might look like, affirmatively, rather than being defined negatively as what it is not a man, not a woman, and not binary. I think there is a real need, particularly in trans studies, for the challenge of developing affirmative methodological projects that don't reduce to a single principle for which we already have entire academic inquiry and bodies of knowledge eager to do the same intellectual maneuvers with us over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jules. That was very provocative, as you know, so looking forward to the conversation. Okay, next we have Z or Zed Nicolazo. Zed Nicolazo is Associate Professor of Trans Studies in Education at the University of Arizona. Her forthcoming book, Digital Me, Trans Students Exploring Future Possible Selves Online, will be published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. Welcome, Z.
Thank you. And thanks to Robin and Jules. Jules, there's going to be a little bit of overlap between our 2 talks. And for people in attendance, I promise that we did not plan this. We might just be in some similar discussion circles and having some similar conversations. So really,
humbled and honored to be on this panel, and big thanks to Linda, Nick, Mark, and also a special shout out to JT, who's been good family for a number of years now. It's really nice to be on this panel and to be with you all virtually. I'm going to share my screen. I do have a couple of slides for folks to take a peek at, so hopefully that works. And we'll just start. So the talk that I'll give today is called Non-Binary as Wedge Trans Politics. Again, I think that you'll see some overlap actually, especially with what Jules has shared and a little bit that Robin has talked about. So when I was thinking about the brief that we were given for this panel in terms of what's happening in relation to non-binary research, and when I was thinking about my particular location in the academy, broadly speaking of education studies, and more specifically of higher education studies, what I was noticing was this little trend of thinking about this non-binary, binary. And I know that Jules mentioned that, and so this wording and this phrasing has certainly come up through education studies, and I'm thinking about this as in a little bit of a different way than what Robin is talking about. So Robin was saying how non-binary can be a process that undermines taxonomy. I actually think the way that this is being taken up in research is actually as a way to reinforce a particular taxonomy, and to do it, as Jules was saying, in an anti-trans woman and anti-Black way. And so this is the phenomenon that I'm wanting to trace and think about. Here are some examples from research. I decided not to put people's names on these statements that come from academically published articles, although I'm sure people just do a quick screenshot and find out who's writing them if you want to. So specifically, I'm kind of underlining some pieces where folks are talking about trans students who hold binary trans identities, or who are primarily or exclusively described as binary identified, with the example given of trans men and trans women. Also, this bottom example not only reasserts the idea of binary trans people, but also locates this in the academy and as a problem of the academy, something that the academy ought to take up, specifically gender and sexuality studies, although clearly it's something that various other fields are starting to embrace and think about, much to my chagrin. So these are just a smattering of examples of what I'm seeing in terms of this non-binary, binary phenomenon. So the purpose then of my talk is to address what I see as this unfortunate trope of the non-binary, binary. So as I suggested, there's the strand of current gender research that suggests that the trans subject is either binary or non-binary, which I argue conjures ethical and political implications alongside the simplistic misreading of the phenomenon of trans. And this might be maybe the shift or perhaps an extension of what Jules was talking about. I also end my presentation with some questions, so there will be a couple more questions that folks can get animated around, hopefully as a way to provoke more conversation. So in this way, the figure of the non-binary person becomes a mode through which the project or to project a form of wedge politics that serves to fracture solidarity in and beyond trans and queer communities. So through the calcification of a non-binary, binary, I argue that trans research further reifies this kind of connection between epistemic and ontological violence that marks the ongoing technology of trans misogyny. So there are some ethical and political lines drawn, and I'll give kind of the main argument. This non-binary, binary, say that 5 times fast, furthers an ethical and political mode of capture, and specifically one that's rooted in trans misogyny. So to create, maintain, and further this type of binary is actually to make ethical and political claims, is what I'm arguing. That the non-binary is positioned, the figure of non-binary is positioned as radical and truly transgressive, whereas the figure of the binary or the binary trans person is seen as regressive, as staid, as static, as old, done, right? And this binary argument relies on a particular level of surveillance of who can be deemed and recognized as trans, who can be deemed to be trans enough, which in this argument suggests non-binary, as radical as transgressive. If we take seriously the way that surveillance is operating, then we can understand this as a manifestation of the technology of transmisogyny, as Jules was talking about, and as several other people have been talking about, who I'll name in a slide later on down the road. So much of the surveillance is actually about embodiment, as in the surveillance of bodies, and much of the policing of trans embodied practices is aimed at and focused on trans women and girls, and specifically in the US context, Black trans women and girls. So we can see a particular type of enmeshment around anti-trans woman and anti-Black that seems to be congealing here if we recognize the surveillance of how this binary operates. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how this binary as a problem kind of operates. This is something that I've written about with my colleague, Dr. TJ Jorian. There's a blog post where we talk about and articulate 6 of the problems with the non-binary, binary. So I'm not going to rehash that work per se, but I do want to talk about a couple of things that might be of interest for us together. One is that the non-binary, binary as a framework through which trans is understood through academic study. This is where that red highlighted text becomes particularly important for us. So this binary is used as a form of categorizing, capturing trans, and is such within the academy. So it's placed in academic studies and academe in general, right? And I similarly, I guess I have some questions, and I hear Jules maybe asking some similar questions around this. I've yet to meet anyone who identifies as a binary trans person, nor do I really even know what that might mean. And I think that ultimately what it means is deeply problematic, right? If we go back to this way that we think about binary ethically and politically. And the other piece that I want to talk about around trans, and particularly academic trans studies as an extension of whiteness. So as trans has been colonized and ushered into the academy, it's continued to be made white, epistemically and ontologically. I actually think that my position at the University of Arizona is probably a very good indicator of that. For folks that don't know, I'm a part of what they called a Trans Studies Initiative at the time. It was the first of its kind trans cluster hire to hire trans scholars doing trans things. And the 4 of us that were hired were white. Overwhelmingly, the people who applied for these positions were white. Susan Stryker writes about this in a recent issue of TSQ. And also the other piece of this that becomes really important is that most of the people who applied for and got these jobs were not trans women, right? Which becomes another important point as we think about how trans is taken up through academic studies and in the academy. So as a site of surveillance, then, academic trans and academic trans studies is a project that's anti-Black and rooted in anti-trans women's sentiment and rhetoric. Again, this is a little bit of a rehash, and Jules has much better words than I do, so hopefully I'm not boring people at this point too much. So I want to pause real quick and talk about what this talk is not for a second. So I'm not suggesting, and I hope that people are not hearing me say that non-binary people are bad or unreal. That is certainly not what I'm saying. I'm also not saying that we should all embrace a general trans theory or theorizing. So Ava Hayward, Kaji Amin, Jules Gill-Peterson, Jules, please correct me if I'm misunderstanding your work, and many others are suggesting that we actually need more specificity, not less. And specifically, the phenomenon of trans, as fused to and understood through transmisogyny and anti-Black, transmisogynoiristic logics, demands deeper and more careful articulations of gender, race, sexuality. And yet, I would argue this non-binary, binary is really not the way to get us there. So I want to think now about wedge politics as a furthering of conservative logics. And the idea here is that that this form of wedge politics, this non-binary, binary, actually furthers conservative logics as a way to underscore trans killability, which is to say that the binary creates epistemic and ontological effects rooted in anti-trans woman and anti-Black notions of killability, which are themselves a foundation to the project of the university in which academic trans studies is embedded. And if people have questions, I'm happy to talk more about that. I have a piece coming out that talks about trans killability as the bedrock of higher education writ large, coming out soon. So this actually is a cleaving apart in this bit. It posits an unreal ethical and political divide. And this is actually laced with normative judgments and steeped in modes of surveillance and based on notions of capture and categorization, which are inherently dangerous. It actually serves to stop political imaginaries against broader systems of oppression under which we all exist, and actually further this breakage is focusing on the needs of the most vulnerable. I also wonder, who does it actually serve to create, maintain, and further the non-binary, binary? Here's a tip: not trans folks. And so I think that is something that we need to reckon with. It actually plays on simplistic and reductive notions of gender. It doesn't desire more from gender and largely serves non-trans audiences. So then what is this talk? I've talked about what it's not, but what is this talk? So what I'm saying is that we should want and desire more than the conservative logics that are being taken up allow. What I'm saying is that we should interrogate, confront, and seek to resist the anti-trans woman and anti-underpinnings of academic trans studies. I'm saying that we can be more specific without creating ethical and political quagmires that cleave us apart. I'm thinking back to Lucy's presentation earlier in the day, citing Cohen's work, which is right in line with how I'm thinking here ethically and politically. And I'm saying that I think we can be together without losing a sense of who we are for and with ourselves. So here I'm recognizing research as a site of being with and thinking relation, relational, and relationality in particular configurations. And yet we can only do this if we think about the epistemic and ontological commitments that we're making through reinforcing or corroding the binary that I've been talking about. So here are some of my questions as I wrap up today. I have 5 for folks to kind of think about. What would it mean to do research and inquiry from this of loving trans women and girls? And how can we think about that as a starting place? And here I'm thinking about love in terms of thinking about deep community alongside. I think sometimes the notion of love can get twisted in various different ways. So again, happy to talk about that if folks would like to afterwards. How could we think about investing in logics that are corrosive to conservative regimes of knowledge power that are rooted in anti-Black and anti-trans women logics? Who could benefit if we let go of the non-binary, binary? What might the insistence of not letting it go say about those people, disciplines, fields, and sites of academic knowledge production who and that are holding firm to it, right? So some introspective work that we probably might want to do. And what solidarity moves and movements could we imagine beyond the binary, this non-binary, binary, all while not losing the specificity of trans experiences across subjectivities? So those are some questions that I have, and yeah, happy to talk through that, but also happy to shut up now. So thanks.
Okay, we're going to open. We're going to go through the Q&A. Lots of really important and critical points to discuss. This panel is actually its own colloquium, I think. And the question of, questioning the theme of the conference beyond binary, and really the other part of that question is which binary are we actually trying to provoke and move beyond, and looking at the ways in which the framing search, the kinds of questions we choose to ask or not ask, where we choose to begin, ends up creating a new set of problems, dangers, in some cases, for non-binary peoples. So let's start with the Q&A. Let's see. All right. So the first couple questions are directed to Robin. So I'll pose those to you. So one person is saying, I love what Robin Demroff said about there not being a single essence to gender, to any gender category. Do other presenters find this concept useful in the conversation about gender? So the question about moving beyond essence. And then the second part of the question was, since you reference gender as class understandings and your definition of non-binary very much referenced these understandings, that is class, as a way of putting emphasis on political consciousness, I was wondering if you wouldn't agree that a peculiar effect of non-binary is that the people who are perceived as belonging to the category and are therefore discriminated against as such are to a significant degree not identical to the people who consider themselves non-binary. So would you mind saying more about consciousness as a necessary condition to be non-binary? So that's a question for Robin. You want to take that one?
Yeah, I can just say something really quick, which is just that when I said I was focused on context where non-binary was taken seriously as like an alternative, I think that the majority of the time not saying that this has to be the case, but I think just in fact, the majority of the time that people who are non-binary are discriminated against because they say that they're non-binary and there's a reaction to that, it's because it's not being taken seriously. It's because they're seen as a deviant man or a deviant woman and not actually being in some other kind of space. So I'm not sure. I would have to think more about what it would look like in a community that's affirming of that category for someone to then be discriminated against for belonging to that category in the kind of systemic way that I was interested in at the beginning of my talk.
So there's a request, Jules, for a reading list for your presentation, which opens up a larger, I think, question about whether we want to perhaps crowdsource a reading list through these after this conference. So that's something. But if Jules, if you want to provide a reading list, people would be very much happy to receive one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, in the sense that I'm doing my own scholarly work.
Right.
I do that work when I'm teaching. So, but all of the work that I referenced is really foundational texts in trans studies. So I'm hardly the first person to read them. But so that's just sort of.
Yeah, I think I think it might just make sense to crowdsource one because there are lots of different references that people have brought into the conversation today. Yeah. Let's see. There's a question about, and this speaks probably directly to Zed's presentation, but someone is asking, can you speak to the ways that binary trans identity is often a requirement for seeking gender-affirming healthcare in the health systems, and how negative views of binary trans identity have the possibility to prevent trans individuals from seeking out transition services?
I can try as someone who is not a medical expert or academic. Yeah, you're right. The way that surveillance and biopolitics works suggests that trans people need to present certain narratives in order to gain access to, in many ways, life-saving medical treatment. I recognize that. And also, I don't think that necessarily requires that we, as trans communities, adhere to a non-binary, binary. I wonder if it's a false construct to say that someone needs to say that they're a binary trans person in order to get the medical the medical services that they need. And so that's how I might ask the question, right? Like, I think some of the questions that I'm asking, some of the questions that Jules are asking, are questions around who does it serve and to what ends, to reinforce what we and other people have been arguing is the reassertion of an anti-trans woman and anti-Black stance within trans communities and academic trans studies. I don't know, Jules, if you have other things that you might want to offer too.
Sure, yeah, I think it's actually a really useful example, right? To think through a little bit. So, in theory, there is no requirement to adhere to any particular model of gender identity in order to access a provider. But of course, and so that's sort of, I'm referring to the gender affirming care model that, in a private healthcare landscape is really just a set of ideals. It's literally pieces of paper or statements on websites, and we have absolutely no way to know what the state of trans healthcare is in the country. But I also think that, there's an interesting question that I think this session is sort of bringing us to, right? Which is how are institutions that have successfully identified a sort of diversity and inclusion model and a sort of ever expanding taxonomic sort of consumer model of identity, taking advantage of these ostensible divisions in order to pit themselves as progressive, socially progressive institutions that actually magnify forms of harm at the population level, right? And so to my mind, one of the things that, I think it's nice as a form of harm reduction, of course, right? Not to have the horrifically out-of-date gatekeeping system that we used to have. Although, I think lots of people like me as a trans woman of color can testify to going to clinics that proudly proclaim their gender affirming clinical models that are just absolute trash and treat you like garbage as if it's still like the 1960s. So, of course, it's helpful to incorporate non-binary into the medical model. But what I think that does very strategically, right, is one, it casts those institutions as somehow progressive or actually in the service of like helping people, as opposed to egregiously stratifying resources and making determinations about who can have what quality of life and under what conditions they can be made to live or be left to die. And so I think, it's like the way we are asked to think about healthcare is so myopic because most trans people don't have access to healthcare. They never have. They don't right now. And so the sort of incremental kind of reformist imperatives in many ways kind of kick the can down the road and avoid that uncomfortable fact that American healthcare is an industry that makes decisions about who is allowed to live under what conditions and how they should be made to die or disposable instead. And I think trans healthcare is a great example of that. So to me, I think like the question of access is like entirely about material resources and not about identity and taxonomy, right? So for me, a guiding light as a historian is sort of trans activist movements in the 70s that wanted to demedicalize and depathologize trans people, which is different than the depathologization of homosexuality, because in theory, at least, being gay doesn't really require you to go to a doctor on a regular basis, whereas being trans appears to require that, right? But we could quite certainly arrange it in a different way. Say if hormones were available over the counter, free of charge, if surgery was available free and on demand without psychiatric gatekeeping, and if we thought of healthcare as a set of resources to be redistributed and held autonomously in communities. And there are many DIY models or trans-run clinic models that different, trans people tried to form at different points in the past that, this is something I'm writing a book on, so I have lots to say about, right? There could be a really different way of thinking there, right? Where the kind of political and material questions that emerge from transness have nothing to do with categorization. They really have nothing to do with taxonomy. They're not about identity. They're about desire and equity and material resources. What do you want? How can we get it for you? And how can we redress racial and class vulnerabilities that are manufactured and sustained over time, right? And so I think sort of the, one concern I have that is not a concern with non-binary people or non-binary itself, but is a concern with institutional tentacles, right? In the same way we have that, now pretty well-worn critique of sort of non-binary's aesthetic or look being monetized as a kind of white androgynous, flexible form of whatever Sephora ads in June or something. We can also think of sort of the development of holistic patient-centered healthcare as this kind of harmed by making decisions on who deserves care. And that's really continuous with the history of trans healthcare in general, which was explicitly designed, to qualify certain kinds of people as actually deserving the right to transition and disregard other people as disposable, atavistic, and backwards, right? So I also think we could tie that, again, back to higher ed, right? I mean, that's part of what we're doing in this institution every day, not because we want to, but because institutions, truly, are in our bloodstreams, doing damage all the time. So yeah, I think it's sort of an interesting question, right? Where it's like this sort of, we are being asked to look at a problem in terms of taxonomy, in terms of binary and non-binary, right? And to me, it feels ultimately like a little bit of a materialist red herring that helps us miss other things and doesn't always serve us. And just like trans healthcare is terrible, but and healthcare is just terrible in this country. It's a complete disaster. So yeah, I think, in this moment too, I'll just add one last thing to that, right? Like where we're seeing a widespread legislative push across more than half the states to try and outlaw pediatric gender care in particular, right? I think it's like one of these really interesting moments where we have to ask, like, when we're being pushed so hard to the brink, what are we going to turn around and ask for in return, right? Just to cancel these attacks that are coming this way and get to a really minimal reformist sort of liberal imagination that I have seen no evidence for the existence of in the last 300 years, but or like, do we want to turn around and say like, yeah, okay, fine, like you're done, you're over. We're articulating a very, very distinct vision of what equity and social justice would look like for across a wide sort of solidarity group, right? And one thing I was thinking, maybe I'll just throw this out there if people want to respond to. A couple of folks have mentioned Kathy Cohen's important work, right? Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, one of my favorite essays in queer studies, comes out in the 90s. One of the things that Cohen mentions that's really helpful, and here she's drawing on the Combahee River Collective's Black feminist statement from the 70s, right? One of the common misconceptions that we are handed down in trying to understand sort of intersectional or resistant left politics is we think you have to have a shared history of oppression in order to organize politically. So you have to have been oppressed in the same way, right? And Cohen helpfully points out that is in fact a ruse, a ruse of liberalism among other things. So I think we're sort of pushing towards a similar place in this particular session, right? Trying to think that, well, if trans names a very heterogeneous and incommensurable and irreducible set of people in the world, right? That's not necessarily a problem in and of itself for effective political action, as long as we give up the idea that we have to share the same experience in order to do anything together.
And so I think this has come up in Robin's presentation, and someone is asking about it again. It's really the positioning of the non-binary person as this inherently radical actor. So the question was about whether they're asking about whether non-binary identity necessarily does something different or more or closer to the kind of edge of some radical political action that the category trans itself doesn't do, that category trans women doesn't do. So if any of you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it, because I think it's come up in different ways since this morning, right?
I mean, can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I just want to say, so the first thing I want to just clarify is, I think it came up in an earlier talk that the idea that I had said that non-binary destroys taxonomy, I definitely don't think that. don't think non-binary destroys taxonomy. I think non-binary, along with all of these other kinds of identifications that we're talking about, change taxonomy, right? They change the kinds of words that we use to talk about ourselves and to describe other people and the way that we form organizations around that. I totally agree with what Jules said about how at the bottom it's about desire and it's about embodiment and it's about actualization. Like I'm saying more words than you said, but you definitely said it's about desire. Like I agree with that, and I think that gender is a kind of shared, all these kinds of more or less shared conceptual and linguistic tools that we use to try to be intelligible to other people and that we use to try to actualize our desires and realize our desires. But I definitely don't think that, I guess maybe I don't think that non-binary has the promise of doing all the work that some of the other presenters have suggested that the category inherently does. I think of it through a much more pragmatist lens. Like I have actually published similar critiques of non-binary as being an institutionalized category and reinforcing a binary. And so like I completely agree with that critique. I usually use genderqueer to describe myself for that reason. But at the same time, I think it's true that there are lots of people who don't feel comfortable being categorized as a man or as a woman who have some shared interests, like wanting to have bathrooms that they feel comfortable in, wanting to not be described with gender-specific pronouns, like not having particular sets of norms and expectations applied to them. And there's a need for some sort of common language in order to organize around that particular form of deviance, even though there are many forms of deviance, as like Cohen highlights, I think, that do unify us. And so from my perspective, when I talk about non-binary, I'm talking about a very thin category, which is just like a really diverse group of people who have availed themselves of some kind in order to try to achieve what are shared kind of political interests.
Yeah, and I guess I might offer too that this for me is why some of the ethical and political questions that I was raising feel so important. That again, this is not about non-binary people being bad people or inherently unreal or any kind of claim like that. This is about the figure of non-binary and how it is positioned in opposition to, which is to say, what is the episteme and the knowledge power regime under which the figure of non-binary is constructed to be truly transgressive, against which particularly trans women and Black trans people, are figured as regressive, old, stodgy, what have you. And then what does that do in terms of the ethical and political commitments that we might want to say that we're making around solidarity to do the corrosive work to the absolute wretched medical industrial complex? That's the move from, for me, epistemology to ontology that Jules, I think, so artfully was able to demonstrate through her work, particularly the medical historical work that she's done.
And I might just add too, I think, part of what's so interesting, and I think it's actually a problem in the sense of like something difficult to resolve that is like a useful, energetic motive to keep thinking. I don't want to solve all the things I want to think about. I want to think about them forever. But one of them, right, it has to do with the particular question of producing knowledge as marginalized subjects, or sort of desubjugating knowledge, so to speak, in that idiom of a certain version of trans studies. But this sort of question that we might put in the vein of, say, Robin Wiegman's work, right, of fields of identity knowledge, right, where part of what we're trying to do is effectuate a transition from having been studied as an object of knowledge to being producers of knowledge. But in so doing, we're not just questioning regimes of objectivity, we're also investing deeply held political desires in the projects that we do. And those desires are incredibly idealizing in a lot of instances and can lead to just sort of profound misrecognitions of what's there, right? And this is not something we have to subtract, right? But it does lead to a challenge, which is to say, like, if we are, and I think some of it has to do with the difficulty of being in higher ed in this particular moment, in a deeply anti-intellectual moment, a moment of just extreme burnout of neoliberalism, where pandemic slashing of budgets is just pushing so many institutions beyond the brink, right? And I know certainly in the humanities, there's quite a tendency in our our work to extremely idealize the objects that we write about as bearing ready-made political critiques and alternatives to the entire world. So we're always doing world-saving work all the time. And it's certainly a very attractive thing to do from a professional point of view when your entire profession is under attack and barely exists anymore, right? But it's also sincere, right? I mean, we don't just do this for fun. I mean, I am a nerd. I would sit in archives by myself all day if I could anyways, but like, but I also like deeply care when my body is on the line in my own life, right? And so I think, part of the question is sort of like, how do we build in a reflexivity so as to not always be searching for a kind of moral political mandate that minoritarian subjects literally remake the world constantly in our analyses of them, right? I mean, it's just it's a demand that can only be disappointed, particularly by people in the past who are unlike us, but really by anyone, because no one is quite like us. We should be disappointing, and we do disappoint ourselves too, right? So I think of it as like as a unsolvable but delightful problem, but one that I think is in a pretty intense place right now culturally, just because transness is so extremely politicized at this moment, and obviously there are real stakes involved that all of us have attended to in really thoughtful ways. So I think also part of my perspective is like, I don't think we have to necessarily solve that issue, but to really think about carefully how we engage with it seems like a useful call I'm hearing from everyone here.
And on that note, which is really the opening note for another set of conversations or continuation, I want to thank all of our amazing presenters. It's been wonderful to put faces to names that I've seen on Twitter because I've watched those Twitter fights. And this has been a really beautiful conversation, and we're going to take a break now and to be rejuvenated with some lovely art, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for generously moderating this exchange. And thank you also, to echo Natalie's thanks, the panelists for sharing your ideas, analyses, and works, and for stimulating an excellent discussion around these topics. I know I'm feeling certainly expanded right now. My thinking is expanded in important ways. It's also crystallized in other ways too, by some of the language you've offered me to think through these complex issues. So I'm feeling really, really great in this moment. But I know that we also probably would feel great if we had this break that Natalie spoke of. So 30 minutes from now, we'll be coming back. And so that's 4 p.m. Central Time, but 30 minutes from now, final session of the day, where we will celebrate the work of 2 incredible artists and authors. So this is going to be another great one. Enjoy your 30 minutes.